Hello, everyone. I am pleased to invite to the panel today Dr. Sasha Rush. Sasha is a professor of computer science at Cornell Tech, where his award-winning lab seeks to make deep learning systems, especially generative systems, safer, more clear, and easier to use. In addition to his research, Sasha passionately develops a number of open source projects ranging from a virtual academic conference toolkit to an open machine translation framework to structured prediction libraries. As if that weren't enough, Sasha also works at Hugging Face, where he characterizes his role as an intermediary between the open source and research parts of the organization. Thank you for joining us today, Sasha.
Thanks so much for having me.
I guess to start out, I know that you said that you always loved NLP communities focused on open source, and you drew inspiration from, for instance, the Moses Coder project and others, and was wondering if you could speak about your journey into open source and what you view as the opportunities and challenges of open source today.
Yeah, so as a research grad student, I always used to appreciate the work that the NLP community did in open sourcing tools and models. But I think actually when the kind of deep learning revolution happened around 2014, 2015 in our field, I was even more amazed by how far the deep learning researchers took some of these ideas and kind of the pillars of hardware improving, tooling improving, and modeling improving as kind of pushing forward the area. So for me, kind of utilizing Torch and what would become PyTorch during that period of time was one of these experiences where you could kind of fully express yourself from mathematical models to code and feeling like for the first time I could kind of go from a paper to an implementation in, 10 to 100 lines of code. So that was a real big deal for me. Later on, I had the same feeling when I first saw the initial implementations of Hugging Faces, particularly their implementation of BERT and pre-trained transformer models, just feeling like they made it extremely easy to kind of utilize these in practice. And in fact, at that time, I was kind of working on my own version of the library and kind of just gave up. It was kind of just like, they're doing it better. I should go learn from them. And that's not to say libraries in the intermediate phase, such as scikit-learn, or kind of libraries that make it very easy to use linear models, aren't still an extremely important part of the toolkit, and definitely what I turn to for kind of non-deep learning problems. Coming more towards today, I would say, looking and watching what's been happening with stable diffusion, open source models that do diffusion and other kinds of image generation, even just over the last couple of months, has been kind of remarkable to see, and I've enjoyed kind of following along and seeing how they do that sort of thing. That being said, these are all kind of model-based stuff. As these ideas exit kind of the lab and exit the model space, I think there are a lot of other tools that I think are extremely interesting to use in your day-to-day life. One sort of open source tool I find really interesting these days is ways to make it easier to use low-level models. So systems like TVM or Triton that came out of OpenAI, where they let you and make it easier for mere mortals to program on GPUs or TPUs or kind of low-level systems. I also find experimentation systems like weights and biases or comment to be like extremely critical for the work we do day to day. And we're beginning to see kind of experimentation with kind of UIs for prompting or UIs for image generation. We kind of quickly try out a lot of prompts and see how they move. And people make fun of that stuff, but it's extremely cool, and it's a really kind of new user interface for models.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sasha. You covered a lot there. I know you joined Hugging Face in 2019, and you've spoken about open source opportunities from the low level like Triton to prompting and everything, where you might not even require much of an ML background. What would you view are the big challenges or other opportunities that open up from this usage of large language models and prompt-based programming?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to watch the last year and kind of the development of large models and prompting. It's certainly not something I felt really prepared for or kind of prepped for as an academic. I would say there are kind of two major challenges. So one, simply getting access to these models. Until pretty recently, it was hard for people kind of in the open source community have access to models of the size that we're talking about. Recent projects like OPT from Facebook or Bloom from the Big Science Initiative out of Hugging Face have kind of made it possible to kind of utilize these directly and play with them. But even models that are kind of behind a paywall, like GPT-3, are now becoming like increasingly part of the research project process and kind of trying them out, playing with them. I think what's challenging is that the kind of modality of writing a prompt, having the model produce an answer for you is simply just a kind of new thing for us. It's a hard space to kind of navigate and figure out how it works, and it's hard to kind of guarantee robustness and kind of repeatable results. But we're starting to see a lot of interesting ways to do that, things like chain of thought prompting or other sorts of, I don't know, we call them kind of heuristics to make the models perform better. Yeah, I would say that's kind of where we're at now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned Bloom as an effort to develop these tools outside of the paywall of OpenAI. I'm really fascinated by this effort, and I'm curious on what you view as the future for Bloom and Big Science and some of these initiatives.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Big Science was truly a kind of decentralized effort, and it's one that I can't really speak to as I was kind of mostly a participant in, but I can tell you a little bit about how it arose and what it was. So it was a year-long project that we called Big Science. It started at Hugging Face with a kind of sense of, well, we'd really like to kind of participate in large model training, but we'd like to bring in as many people as we could. Some of the core leaders at Hugging Face were formerly physicists, and they were kind of taking inspiration from some of the large projects that go on in the physics community. To get the project started, we wrote a grant proposal to the French government, and we were able to secure several million of dollars worth of compute resources from them. And to make the project work, we started a large set of different committees for various parts of the project itself. So researchers working on model scaling, on ethics, on data collection, on tokenization, on evaluation, many different working groups. Each of these groups ran relatively independently, and there was a kind of one core team kind of charged with kind of training this large language model, Bloom, at the end of the day. And so there was both kind of very specific work in figuring out how to train the model, but also a lot of work on even just deciding what this model should look like. It was really interesting to me. I mean, when you run a project that's going to take several $1 million and take a year just to train, you have to think very heavily about each of the individual choices that are made. How do you trade off, say, basing it on what you've seen in the literature, basing it versus trying out some new idea, versus, say, kind of adjusting it to the data set you're using in practice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like it took a huge concerted effort. I want to dive a little bit deeper here. I mean, you mentioned that it takes a lot of effort from like different people with lots of interests, both on the ethics side and the regulation side as well, and like the choices about the data that you're actually going to train on and what you're trying to optimize for there. I wonder if could you provide a window into some of the hard decisions you made about what data you're going to train on and the types of characteristics you really want to bake into this model, since it is, to many people, still a black box despite being an open source effort?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, this is something I actually didn't work too much on directly, but I can speak towards how these decisions were made. One thing that's extremely cool about Bloom is that it was very highly documented in all parts of the process and very collaborative. So for the data set itself, there's a paper that you can get online. It's called the Roots Corpus, ROOTS. And it describes how the data set was collected and utilized. So some of the sections in the paper discuss how the different languages were incorporated, how open source contributors were able to kind of suggest different parts of the project or contribute more data, how standard corpora were utilized or pruned based on some of the ethical values that were behind the project and kind of written up in a public ethical charter. And then also kind of a little bit more technical details, such as how we did deduplication, how we utilized publicly available resources like the Common Crawl or other aspects of that.
Oh, amazing. Thanks for sharing. We'll try to include that paper link after the conference.
Sure.
Um, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask how you imagine non-data scientists approach interacting with this platform. I mean, worked a lot on making these things more widely available, both through Hugging Face and your own projects. And it's easier than ever to get involved and run a transformer model or access the OpenAI's APIs. And I was wondering what types of risks are involved whenever an organization or an individual goes and starts using these and making decisions in the wild.
For sure. So one caveat I do want to make is that systems of this scale are pretty new to all of us. So I don't think there's a kind of privileged position that PhDs or academics have to kind of some deciding these questions. And so it's going to be an interesting process kind of figuring out how they get used in practice. I will say, though, the one thing that academics can say or kind of guidance they can give is that I think anyone who's played with these models knows that the actual usage of them differs from some of the kind of press coverage or some of the most wild cases you see in practice. The models are good, and they can often be surprisingly good, but they don't behave in a way that you'd expect. And there's been all sorts of interesting papers where people provide prompts that look nothing like what a human would expect, and the model does well, or vice versa, prompts that even any human would understand, where the model kind of fails miserably. So I think the kind of main things to take away are to just be careful, measure, make test data sets, be quantitative, anything you can do to kind of understand the limits or the boundaries of what these things will do are worth testing and keeping track of it as you go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It takes a lot of testing and like limit testing, validation, and all these types of approaches to make sure that you can keep it within the constraints of what you want it to be working on, despite being general purpose agents, as claimed by many in the press coverage, as you said. And I appreciate the caveat that you added there that really anyone, regardless of your academic qualifications, could use these types of things. I wanted to ask another question. In a recent interview, you said that at the end of the day, if you feel like you know what's going on, you probably aren't taking enough risks. And I wanted to just turn it over to you. What do you think is the biggest risk or biggest risks you're taking right now in order to expand your understanding of AI and NLP?
Yeah, I think I'm often fascinated by the way science moves and the way machine learning has moved in recent years, which is, I think we have this kind of model in our head that the theory comes first and then we can kind of utilize things. And at least in this area, the theory is really trailing quite behind kind of the practical usage of the models. And that can be a little bit scary. Like, we can't guarantee that models will behave the way we'd like them to. But I think as long as you're careful with kind of the use cases and kind of what you're exploring along this path, there's a lot kind of empirically minded people can do or try out in this space. So yeah, what have we been playing with recently? One of our recent papers, which is like kind of a little bit playful from our end, was we basically replaced a rendering engine, so like a HTML or LaTeX rendering engine, completely with diffusion models. So you can kind of go from LaTeX code or HTML code and just render directly to an image. And I think one thing that's been interesting about this for us is like, how might you combine, say, structured data with natural language data, kind of generative process, like kind of describe natural scenes, but also have structured formulations for it, how you might generate in that case. And the results are kind of surprising to me. It like works extremely well. And so it's not something I yet understand, but we're kind of playing around with what that might lead to.
That's amazing. I like how you put that in there. It's playful in that no matter what your background is and stuff, it's a lot of this phenomenon is truly new to all of us, and it's really important to go and test it out and see what it can do, and before developing an understanding. Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask, how would you recommend people listening to this video get more involved in open source NLP, more involved in some of these like evaluation and understanding efforts, and in making I guess contributions to making this more widely accessible and safe in general?
Yeah, I mean it's a great time to do it. So a couple things you can do. One is that Hugging Face tends to have kind of hackathons every once in a while. They often look for people with all different kind of skill levels and backgrounds. So whether it's collecting data sets or writing prompts or making models, that's all available. The other thing you can get involved with is there are some like slightly more out there kind of organizations like Elator AI or a couple others that have Discord channels that you can join, talk to people there, meet people, and talk to them. And then generally, I just love GitHub. I wanted to get involved in an open source project recently, and I just sent a PR to the author, and he accepted it. And then we worked together basically for the whole summer, kind of coding on this thing. Never met him. We never really talked. We just kind of talked at GitHub, but it's been fun. And so people are generally relatively open to that sort of contribution.
That's lovely. Thank you, Sasha. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for organizing, or thank you for joining us, and I look forward to speaking later.
Sounds good.